Hi, my name is John Linstrom, and it's a pleasure to be able to give this virtual talk to the River City Grand Rapids area chapter of The Wild Ones. I think your motto of healing the earth one garden at a time fits perfectly with the personal mission of the famous Michigander who I'm going to tell you a little about today. And I'm very grateful to your organization, both for the work you do and for the opportunity to share Bailey's fascinating story. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person at the Bunker Hill Interpretive Center, but I hope we can make this virtual format work and that you'll feel free to reach out to me with any questions you may have after listening to this presentation. I'll be sure to include an email address at the end of this talk so that you can reach out. And I've also prepared some slides to illustrate some of the points I'll be making. So I'll be switching back and forth with PowerPoint throughout this lecture. So here's the first attempt at doing that. So the title of my talk today is Liberty Hyde Bailey, New Agrarian Philosopher and Patron Saint of American Gardening. Now, Bailey lived such a long, productive and varied life that there are many angles from which you might approach his story, but this title gives you some sense of the approach I hope to take. I'm going to tell you some of the story of Bailey's childhood and young life in Michigan, and something of his contributions both to what we call New Agrarian thought and to American gardening, and what all that has to offer to how we think about our place in the natural world today. In the process, I'll share some excerpts from Bailey's garden writings, which my colleague John Stempien and I have collected in our recent print anthology, The Liberty Hyde Bailey Gardener's Companion, which you see here. And I'll also share some of the insights of our recent online exhibition related to that book, which I hope you'll all check out at my website, lhbaileyproject.com. You see a screenshot on this page as well. So before I get into Bailey's story, I just want to provide a brief introduction for myself, which will also help to explain how I became involved in Bailey's scholarship and work. So I grew up in South Haven, Michigan, which, as most of you know, is just an hour south of Grand Rapids on the lake, and which is also Bailey's hometown, and today the site of the Liberty Hyde Bailey Museum and Gardens, which you see here. This is a photo that I took back when I was working there during an exhibition that I had curated. When I graduated from high school in 2006, though, I didn't know a thing about Bailey. The museum didn't do children's programming in those days, and to my knowledge, I hadn't been exposed to this famous South Havenite in any of my schoolwork. In college, I majored in English and did my senior honors project on some of the environmental aspects of the writing of Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman. And it was toward the end of that work that I became aware of the famous environmental philosopher from my own hometown. I found an old biography of Bailey in the campus library, and by the time I entered Iowa State University the next year to begin an MFA in creative writing and environment, I had met the director of the museum and begun to devour as many of Bailey's literary and philosophical books that I could get my hands on, almost all of them out of print. I came back home to South Haven for that first summer of the MFA program to do an internship at the Bailey Museum, where I began by organizing the massive collection of boxed up books written and edited by Bailey, something like 200 volumes, which I was shocked to learn was still an incomplete collection. The next summer I was back, this time on paid part-time staff as a curator, and the summer after that, MFA degree in hand, I returned as museum director, a position I held through the off-season that year and through yet another summer. During those 4 years that I was variously attached to this museum, the little nonprofit changed dramatically, revamping its exhibition space around the story of Bailey's life in an ongoing exhibit that stayed up for about 5 years, while we also inaugurated annual rotating programs on deeper, more focused dives into Bailey's life and work. We also started organizing children's programming for the first time in the museum's history, bringing Bailey's story to a broad swath of South Haven school kids. Meanwhile, my mother, a 4th grade teacher at North Shore Elementary School, mobilized a group of volunteers to turn an underutilized area of their school grounds into the Liberty Hyde Bailey Outdoor Learning Center, which you see here, featuring several raised beds, trails through the woods, a wetland overlook, a butterfly garden, and a full outdoor classroom. My mom actually received a grant from the Kalamazoo chapter of the Wild Ones to purchase plants for their relatively new butterfly garden, which is located beyond the line of trees that you see in the background here. So she and I are grateful to the organization for that support of outdoor learning in the public schools. What I had begun to realize in my work at the museum and in the community was not only that Bailey held great local significance, but that he was a truly international figure who was even a household name in certain parts of this country just 100 years ago. He revolutionized the science of horticulture, which is the study of cultivated plants. He changed the face of higher education. He helped change how science was taught in public schools. He was a pioneer of farming practices that today we might call sustainable or organic, like planting with cover crops. He influenced generations of very important environmental thinkers like Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, and Wendell Berry. He was a forerunner in the field of rural sociology. And he was a best-selling author of popular books and countless articles on the subject of gardening. There was more I wanted to do at an intellectual level to engage Bailey's work in the context of this historical moment in American letters. So after my 4th summer at the museum, I headed off to New York for a PhD in English and American literature at NYU, which is where I am today, finishing a dissertation this year that puts Bailey's writings into conversation with West Michigan author and Potawatomi chief Simon Pokagon, and the great Harlem Renaissance author and ethnographer Zora Neale Hurston, while I work part-time this year as a Public Humanities Fellow at the Museum of the City of New York. Since I've been at NYU, I've also edited the centennial edition of Bailey's ecological manifesto, The Holy Earth, and co-edited that collection of his garden writings that I mentioned earlier, the Liberty Hyde Bailey Gardener's Companion. I'm also now the editor of a series of books to be published by Cornell University Press called the Liberty Hyde Bailey Library, which will bring many of Bailey's books back into print for the first time since his death in 1954. In some cases, it's been much longer. Suffice it to say that when I pulled that biography off the college library shelf in the winter of 2010, I had no idea how Liberty Hyde Bailey would have completely changed my life over the course of the ensuing decade. So who was this guy? Why do I care? And why should you care? At the local level, since I'm addressing the River City, Grand Rapids area chapter of the Wild Ones, the story of Bailey's upbringing is the story of the so-called frontier days of West Michigan. And that story paints a picture of a moment in your history. So I'll start there. In a larger sense, though, Bailey's life and writings represent the working out of a philosophy of life that prepares us to tackle some of the most pressing current challenges we face as a society, from climate change to the preservation of democracy, by teaching us how to shape our lives around what he called the outlook to nature, how to ground ourselves in the true facts of life on this planet, and in an awareness of how we flourish better when we learn to better care for the people, plants, and animals different from ourselves. That sounds pretty heady, and I'll come back to it throughout this talk, and also the ways that it all comes back for Bailey to gardening. But first, to set the stage, I'd like to read a short excerpt from the preface that I wrote for the Liberty Hyde Bailey Gardener's Companion. This will kind of set the stage historically for us. December 1861 was a dark month in the lives of one family on the western frontier. Much like the snows of the Michigan winter that had begun to settle around their small, box-like frame house, erected just 4 years earlier to replace the drafty log cabin that had preceded it, a grave sickness began to settle into the family. The deep rashes and strep throat of scarlet fever passed from one child to the next, infecting all 3 sons and leaving only the anxious mother and father unafflicted to care for their children. As winter wore on, the eldest son's health continued to deteriorate, and in February, the 14-year-old died at home in the old custom, surrounded by his grieving parents and his 2 younger brothers, one 13 years old and the other only 3. That 3-year-old would not remember that day, but he would remember the tragedy that struck the following December when he stood with his father and brother beside the sickbed of his mother, Sarah, and watched her pass into the silence, as he would later relate, the victim of diphtheria, a disease without a cure. A woman of artistic sensibility who had learned to write as an adult and even took to composing poetry to share with her family, Sarah never recovered from the grief of losing her eldest son, but she left behind traces of the artful grace with which she had cared for the frontier farm home. Among those traces was a small garden of hardy perennial flowers in the front of the house, facing the path that led into town. When planting that garden, Sarah had let her beloved youngest son drop the seeds into their places, and now that she was gone, her surviving husband took time out of his regular farm work to help the 4-year-old care for that garden, especially his favorite flowers, the bright splashes of the little garden pinks, or Dianthus plumarius, more commonly known as cottage pinks. So life grew in the wake of loss, and the young child, known by the family as little Tom, by the children of the neighborhood as Libby, and on his birth certificate as Liberty Hyde Bailey, Jr., learned to love the rhythms of the garden. So in the anthology, we follow Bailey's biographers in locating the genesis of his love of gardening in his young childhood and in that garden of pinks that his mother left him. Bailey also ended up becoming his father's most trusted farmhand as he grew into a young man, and as the Bailey farm became known in West Michigan for the excellence and variety of its apples in particular. These were the days before blueberry cultivation, and South Haven first gained its reputation as a fruit town through its apples and peaches. Bailey was such a good apple grafter that he was hired by many other farmers in the area to help with their trees. And throughout his adult life, he would reminisce about the opportunities that farm life afforded him to observe wildlife, spend spare moments contemplating the mysteries of a meandering brook, the rhythm of the hoe, the calls of birds. Passenger pigeons were still numerous in those days, still able to darken the skies with their incredible miles-long flocks, and settler colonialism was still recent enough locally that property boundaries were often necessarily permeable. Bailey would remember a group of Potawatomi people with a relatively permanent settlement on one end of the family's property, and it was his father's opinion that they could stay there as long as they wanted to. There was a certain amount of language exchange between the local Potawatomi and the settlers, who in mid-19th century South Haven were racially both white and black, the settlers. And Bailey would remember at his 90th birthday party in 1948 the experience of learning with the Potawatomi children how to catch small numbers of passenger pigeons when they made their legendary migrations. If we take Bailey at his own word, much of this early West Michigan history indelibly shaped his later work in philosophy, both in terms of his agrarian upbringing and the influence of his Potawatomi neighbors, despite the fact that he was destined to spend most of his adult life in upstate New York. In fact, an essay on Bailey that I wrote with historian Daniel Rinn is forthcoming in a book that's going to be published this winter, and it specifically identifies Bailey as a Midwestern intellectual due to these Michigan roots. That book will be titled The Sower and the Seer, Intellectual Perspectives on the That book will be titled The Sower and the Seer, and it's got a complicated subtitle, Perspectives on the Intellectual History of the American Midwest. And it actually takes its title from Bailey's poem Sower and Seer, which was published in his book of poems Wind and Weather in 1916. So anyway, keep a lookout for that book, hopefully in early 2021. Now back to Bailey. When he was growing up in the middle of the 19th century, the American agricultural landscape looked a lot different than it does today. But the great population shift from country to city was already beginning. Early in that century, the vast majority of Americans still lived on farms. By the end of that century, it would shrink to about a third, a proportion that narrowed further in the second half of Bailey's long life, and in the latter half of the 20th century would get down to roughly the 2% of Americans who live on farms today. This is a huge and hugely fast shift in terms of the history of human populations. The farming that Bailey did and that the Bailey family did in South Haven would have been more than subsistence farming. They grew most of what they needed to eat, heat their home, and clothe themselves, but Bailey's parents had chosen to settle in South Haven in part because it was a port town with potential trade with Chicago, the potential for trade with Chicago, and eventually they did export their produce in that way, over time making enough to live comfortably and supplement their lifestyle with commodities bought in town, although by all accounts, Bailey's parents preferred a simple lifestyle even after that level of success. The farming itself was still very manual and also cooperative within the community, as an older Bailey recalled in an essay titled From Haying Time to Radio. Here's a description of what it was like from that same essay I was just describing that I co-wrote with Daniel Wren. And this description draws from Bailey's essay From Haying Time to Radio. It was haying time on a small Midwestern farm in the latter half of the 19th century. Liberty Hyde Bailey Jr. watched as his father, the senior Bailey, scythe in hand, joined other farmers in mowing an open meadow. It was a recurring seasonal event in which farmers cut and dried grasses for later use as animal fodder. A young boy, Bailey did not participate in the mowing itself. He was not big enough to swing a scythe to much effect. He aided the effort in different capacities, sometimes providing food and water to the men working, or at other times, simply taking a hand rake to the ground to consolidate the fallen grasses into neat piles. More often than not, perhaps, he simply watched. While the grasses ran high, the meadow had contained mysteries. Rabbits, birds, and other natural wonders seemed to be contained within. Yet the meadow was, quote, forbidden territory to young Bailey, off limits until it was time to process the hay. His curiosity hard to contain, he skirted every inch of the meadow's perimeter, climbed atop fence rails, scaled a large stump for an aerial view, and relied on any means possible to glean an insight into the grassy wilderness, as he would later call it. Haying time, then, was a very special event. He and his childhood friends knew, quote, there must be strange things in the depths of the grass. The mowing would disclose it all, and eagerly we would watch the mowers, end quote. With interest, he watched and waited for a new landscape to emerge as the grasses fell. Haying time was fixed at an important intersection in Bailey's understanding of the world. Such labor required the help of neighbors, which in turn provided an opportunity for sharing stories and forming personal relationships. It required, too, sweat, exhaustion, investing one's sense of self in the land. Maybe most important, harvesting the meadow's grasses was an aesthetic experience. Bailey found a certain beauty in the way a landscape seemed to change and co-evolve as humans interacted with the natural world. For Bailey, the meadow was a natural landscape year-round. As such, it sometimes included tall grasses and hidden wildlife, and at other times it included farmers and threshers. No matter the time of year, one could witness evolutionary processes continuously at work. As Bailey would later describe in many lectures, books, and poems, humanity and nature were deeply interwoven. If scientists failed to recognize this entanglement, then they failed to understand and express the quality of the landscape. Indeed, this responsibility would ultimately fall on the shoulders of horticulturists, the farmers and gardeners who understood nature's beauty as well as its botany. Aesthetic experience and expression were the tenets of a far-reaching environmental cosmology that, for Bailey, united nature and culture, art and science, farming and poetry. So that's an excerpt from that essay. Aside from local interest, now the reason I have dwelt on Bailey's childhood is that he would return to it himself time and again in his later writings as formative to his philosophy, despite all the high-profile educational and civic work he would go on to do as an adult. After going off to college at Michigan's then fairly new agricultural college, which we now know as Michigan State University, Bailey would study under the great botanist Asa Gray at Harvard, take a pivotal role chairing the nation's first Department of Horticulture and Landscape Gardening at his alma mater, Michigan State. And after a few years setting the direction of that department and beginning to shape a vision for agricultural extension work, he would head off for Cornell University and throw himself into the horticulture department and extension station there, eventually securing funds to establish the New York State College of Agriculture, serve 10 years as its dean, and chair the National Commission on Country Life under Theodore Roosevelt, all before retiring early and devoting himself to his philosophical publications and his studies in horticultural botany. He was an active and influential man of his time, and a progressive in many ways. He hired the first women professors at Cornell to teach in the nature study and home economics departments. He believed in leveraging science to improve farming and farm life, and he welcomed time-saving improvements that would particularly improve the quality of life for women working on farms. The 1909 report of the Country Life Commission, which Bailey largely authored and which became a highly influential document in the country life movement throughout the early 20th century, recommends many reforms which came to pass in the ensuing years, including rural electrification, a parcel post system, and paved highways. Bailey's hope was for what he sometimes called a new rural civilization, a new social order in which the people who worked the land would be valued by society for their labor as much as the rapidly unionizing urban workers of the progressive era and in the ensuing decades. He believed that the kinds of experiences he enjoyed in his childhood were important for reminding people where they fit in the natural world. Like the local farmers coming together for haying time, moving from farm to farm to help their neighbors with the labor-intensive work of harvesting the timothy and other grasses and grains. Cooperation was necessary for survival, Bailey knew, and everyone knew intimately where their food came from in that world of his childhood, not to mention the building materials of their homes, the cloth for their clothes, the tallow for their candles, and on and on. He thought this sort of awareness helped keep people's perspectives grounded by constantly reinforcing the conditions of life. In contrast, when people forgot these conditions, they were more apt to go off in vague heresies, as he put it. He believed there would be a natural movement of the population into cities, as he was observing and as we've seen accelerate over the centuries since. But he also believed that reforms should be put in place to safeguard farm life against the pressures of the market, to the extent that people who wanted to live on the land and were good farmers could still do so. A good farmer, in his mind, shouldn't necessarily mean profitable either. He defined it this way in his book, The Country Life Movement in the United States in 1911. Quote, "The requirements of a good farmer are at least four: the ability to make a full and comfortable living from the land, to rear a family carefully and well, to be of good service to the community, and to leave the farm more productive than it was when he took it." As we know from the history of the 20th century, especially since the Second World War, which Bailey did live to see the end of, American farming ultimately went a different direction than what Bailey envisioned. Based on federal farm policies, the qualities of Bailey's good farmer would not be enough to afford to stay on the land. Rewards were put in place to encourage farmers to get big or get out, as US Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz infamously put it in the 1970s. And today, very few of us have the kind of working knowledge of the land that Bailey grew up with. The industrialization of agriculture has had significant effects not only on the degradation of land biodiversity, as I'm sure I don't need to explain to this group, but also on the undermining of rural communities. We are today nowhere near where Bailey hoped we would be, and there is much we can still learn from his writings about how we might begin to address some of these ecological and social crises. However, when it comes to the outlook to nature, which I referenced earlier, Bailey had good news for us town, city, and suburb folk. The first bit of good news is that nature is available to us everywhere. As he writes in the essay Gardening and Its Future, autumn and winter, spring and summer come to every window. The second bit of good news is that we can all come into closer sympathy and contact with the wonders and processes of nature through a simple, inexpensive activity that is available to just about everyone, and that activity is gardening. Here's how Bailey opens one of his classic books of practical advice for gardeners, his 1898 book, Garden Making. And you'll also find this as the first essay in the Liberty Hyde Bailey Gardener's Companion, which again is this book. Bailey writes, "Every family can have a garden. If there is not a foot of land, there are porches or windows. Wherever there is sunlight, plants may be made to grow, and one plant in a tin can may be a more helpful and inspiring garden to some mind than a whole acre of lawn and flowers may be to another. The satisfaction of a garden does not depend upon the area, nor, happily, upon the cost or rarity of the plants. It depends upon the temper of the person. One must first seek to love plants and nature, and then to cultivate that happy peace of mind which is satisfied with little. He will be happier if he has no rigid and arbitrary ideals, for gardens are coquettish, particularly with the novice. If plants grow and thrive, he should be happy. And if the plants which thrive chance not to be the ones which he planted, they are plants nevertheless, and nature is satisfied with them. We are apt to covet the things which we cannot have, but we are happier when we love the things which grow because they must. A patch of lusty pigweeds growing and crowding in luxuriant abandon may be a better and more worthy object of affection than a bed of coleosis in which every spark of life and spirit and individuality has been sheared out and suppressed. The man who worries morning and night about the dandelions in the lawn will find great relief in loving the dandelions. Each blossom is worth more than a gold coin as it shimmers in the exuberant sunlight of the growing spring and attracts the bees to its bosom. Little children love the dandelions. Why may not we? Love the things nearest at hand and love intensely. If I were to write a motto over the gate of the garden, I should choose the remark which Socrates made as he saw the luxuries in the market. How much there is in the world that I do not want. I verily believe that this paragraph which I have just written is worth more than all the advice with which I intend to cram the succeeding pages." And he goes on from there. There's so much wisdom in this opening, and so much of Bailey's garden philosophy is encapsulated there. The expansive notion that one plant in a tin can, as he puts it, might be the perfect garden for someone without access to a yard is such a democratizing and empowering idea that we knew it would be the perfect way to open our anthology of Bailey's garden writings. It was the inspiration for the little window garden that my wife and I have begun tending to for the past couple of years in our tiny apartment in Queens. Bailey surely would not have believed in the idea that certain people have green thumbs and others don't. As he says in that passage I just quoted, if plants grow and thrive, the gardener should be happy. And if the plants which thrive chance not to be the ones which he planted, they are plants nevertheless, and nature is satisfied with them. And then I love this line, we are apt to covet the things which we cannot have, but we are happier when we grow the things, when we love the things which grow because they must. It's no surprise that Bailey's countless articles in farm and garden periodicals made him such a popular writer. He brought new people into gardening with such zeal that scholar James Cates, in an article on Bailey's agricultural journalism, describes Bailey as the patron saint of American gardening. That's where that phrase comes from. Bailey especially relished his praise of dandelions, which you also get in that passage, and which he would return to time and again in his garden and nature study writings. For Bailey, the ability to love dandelions was the mark of a mind attuned to the everyday marvels of the natural world. In The Nature Study Idea, another of his many books, Bailey writes that, as with all education, nature study's central purpose is to make the individual happy. The happiness of the ignorant man is largely the thoughts born of physical pleasures, That of the educated man is the thoughts born of intellectual pleasures. One may find comradeship in a groggery, the other may find it in a dandelion. And inasmuch as there are more dandelions than groggeries in most communities, the educated man has the greater chance of happiness. It's a great quote for encapsulating Bailey's sort of humorous, writerly pen. So education by means of dandelions. In other words, the love of growing things that we derive from gardening not only helps to ground our perspective in the more than human life of the world around us, it also brings a more sustainable form of happiness than any of the modern artificial forms of entertainment on which we spend so much of our money and time. This nature love and the joy that comes from it is well known, Bailey writes, quote, to every person who longs to walk on the bare ground, who stops in a busy day for the song of a bird, who hears the wind, who looks upward to the clouds. He also believed it should have the power to mobilize people to protect the world that gave them so much. And now I'm going to share the screen again and continue with this PowerPoint. Because I'd like to spend the last portion of this talk exploring this connection that Bailey saw between gardening and the protection of the earth, which I'm sure will resonate with many members of the Wild Ones. And here I'll be drawing on the work I did with my colleague John Stempien for our recent online exhibition that I told you about earlier. That exhibit, which you can view on my website, lhbaileyproject.com, is titled Marvels at Our Feet, The Gardener's Companion, and it extends and supplements our anthology, the Liberty Hyde Bailey Gardener's Companion. The exhibit will take you on a tour through several of the historical gardens that Bailey kept throughout his life, introduce you to a number of the plants mentioned in the anthology that had special meaning for Bailey across his writings, introduce you as well to some of the horticultural forerunners who Bailey also mentions in the anthology, and finally dives deeper into the philosophy of what Bailey called the garden sentiment. And it's that last topic that I'd like to explore with you now to close out this presentation. So hopefully I'm not in the way of that quote. The term garden sentiment comes from an essay in Bailey's book, The Garden Lover, titled To One Who Hath No Garden, and it is included near the beginning of our anthology. So here's a passage from that, and you can read it here. We wish that every person might have a garden. We wish also that every person might have an instrument of music or good books of verse. Yet the year is not lost without them. And if one has not a garden, then must one make the most of the compensations, never foregoing the satisfactions in the gardens that others make, in the gardens kept by the public for such as they. This is only to say that we would have the garden sentiment possessed of all the people, missing not one. Some of the people will grow their own gardens also. This term garden sentiment does not appear with much frequency in Bailey's writings, and it seems to be one more example of his witty ability to coin pithy concepts on the spot that effectively communicate what they mean. The idea fascinated John Stempien and me, though, especially because it is used here to refer to something that Bailey would have possessed of all people, and specifically including those who do not have their own gardens. Even though the particular term appears rarely, it does seem that many of Bailey's garden writings are trying to answer the question of how we might each cultivate that garden sentiment, and that question fueled much of the anthology we ended up compiling. So for the purposes of our online exhibit, we thought about how a kind of intangible garden sentiment manifests itself across the writings in the anthology, and we boiled it down to 4 key concepts, which we called good materials, the picture in the landscape, the backgrounds, and marvels at our feet, the title of the exhibit. So we're going to take a quick look at each of them now. So this next quote comes from The Holy Earth, the book that I showed you in its centennial edition earlier, and which is still in print. The chapter titled The Admiration of Good Materials is also featured in the Gardener's Companion anthology. And here's a quote. I am convinced that we need much to cultivate this appreciation of the physical perfectness of the fruits that we grow. We cannot afford to lose this note from our lives, for this may contribute a good part of our satisfaction of being in the world. The discriminating appreciation that one applies to a picture or a piece of sculpture may be equally applied to any fruit that grows on the commonest tree or bush in our field, or to any animal that stands on a green pasture. It is no doubt the mark of a well-tempered mind that it can understand the significance of the forms in fruits and plants and animals and apply it in the work of the day. The admiration of good materials is an important chapter in The Holy Earth. Bailey believed that to truly admire an apple, a gourd, or a spear of asparagus, you needed to know something about its life history. He describes an old judge at a rural apple festival, the sort that took place in his childhood in South Haven at the old pomological hall, going from plate to plate of displays. And he remarks at the practiced ability of such judges to tell, for instance, that a, quote, stem very long and well set indicates a fruit that does not readily drop in windstorms. This kind of living knowledge of the plant, Bailey believed, heightens the beauty of the fruit itself. And such an appreciation is available to anyone with any access to plants, domesticated or wild, unlike the pictures and pieces of sculpture that he compares with fruits in the quotation we just read together. An artistic appreciation for plants might be a democratizing force in that way, and it enhances everyday joy, our satisfaction of being in the world, for free. Bailey exhibits this joy in his photographic record-keeping of the plants he grew, such as the cyanotype you see here, which records several varieties of melons, including, as you can see, the Grand Rapids melon. He treats the fruits with an artistic eye, inside and out, even though the photographs were also functional records for his horticultural projects. For Bailey, the admiration of good materials leads the admirer's imagination onward, beyond the apple in her hand to the field in which the apple grew. This gives the experience a sort of transcendence, but it is a transcendence born of material knowledge and experience. Here's another fun quote from his book, The Nature Study Idea. He writes, "The best thing in life is sentiment, and the best sentiment is that which is born of the most accurate knowledge." I like to make this application of Emerson's injunction to hitch your wagon to a star, but it must not be forgotten that a person must have the wagon before he has the star, and he must take due care to stay in the wagon when he rides in space. A deep knowledge of the common and near at hand, such as the apple or the melon in this case, would lead to a greater awareness of the interconnectedness of nature, the tree, the field, the farmer, the wind in the branches. To the extent that the natural world was interconnected in ways far beyond us and our human comprehension, Bailey described it as divine in his book, The Holy Earth. Divinity was immanent then in the good materials of the earth that lived within objects on the world, the natural world. Regarding this philosophy, he wrote in The Holy Earth that, quote, "There is no danger of crass materialism if we recognize the original materials as divine, and if we understand our proper relation to the creation, for then will gross selfishness in the use of them be removed." For this reason, he warned that, quote, "Every process that removes us one step farther from the earth is a distinct loss to the people, and yet we are rapidly coming into the habit of taking all things at second hand." That was from 1915. So the next topic is the picture in the landscape, which is a phrase of Bailey's. And let's look at this first part of this quote first. He writes, "The best preparation for garden making is to go afield and to see the things that grow there. Take photographs in order to focus your attention on specific objects, to concentrate your observation, to train your artistic sense. An ardent admirer of nature once told me that he never knew nature until he purchased a camera." Here you have a picture of Bailey with his own camera up on top of a wagon, taking a picture of the landscape. Bailey was an avid and artistic photographer, but it may not be immediately obvious what photography has to do with his outlook to nature. After all, Bailey often wrote in his own books that students of nature should spend less time reading and more time out in the field. He preferred first-hand contact to reproductions, literature, and models. But the ability to better know and appreciate nature would depend greatly on the individual's point of view toward the world around them, because a misleading outlook could result in poor conclusions. He described this as the importance of seeing correctly. And it wasn't the photograph itself that he thought was useful, so much as the action of actually taking the photograph. He gives the gardener this advice, continuing the passage that you see here on the slide. If you have a camera, stop taking pictures of your friends and the making of mere souvenirs, and try the photographing of plants and animals and small landscapes. Notice that the ground glass of your camera concentrates and limits your landscape. The border pieces frame it. Always see how your picture looks on the ground glass before you make the exposure. Move your camera until you have an artistic composition, one that will have a pictorial or picturesque character. Avoid snapshots for such work as this. Take your time. At the end of the year, tell me if you are not a nature lover. That this nature love would manifest itself in the design of the garden and the home. Bailey believed that good garden design, or landscape gardening, should imitate the free and easy dispersal of plants found in undisturbed natural areas. He disliked the then common practice of growing individual plants as showpieces scattered about a front lawn, seen in an illustration from his manual of gardening. Is actually at the right here. These two images are swapped, but the one on the right is the one that was sort of common practice and which he found unattractive and also superficial. The illustration that you see here on the left, by contrast, depicted his ideal of plants arranged into a cohesive picture, symbolizing the ways they grow together in the wild, but are arranged in a way that makes sense to the human eye. So he recognized this wasn't entirely natural, and yet it wasn't as unnatural and forced as this kind of showpiece planting. So here's the quote that we have at the bottom of this slide. A garden or a plant is valuable for the place it occupies as well as for itself. There is satisfaction in the yard in which all parts blend and harmonize. It has character as a whole and as a picture. It has meaning. A yard that has individual plants scattered over it hails you as you pass, and each plant shouts, "See, I cost $5. Creating around one's home a landscape picture, Bailey believed, would encourage the sense that the home is a part of nature, and the people living in such a home would feel more at home in their landscape. This, he believed, was one of the great gifts of both gardening and farming. Good design would create a natural background, which is the landscape term that he would use, to the home that would simulate the effect of domesticity and wildness living side by side. As we see in these two illustrations, Bailey also believed this sort of landscape gardening would make a house a home. Now we come to this term, the backgrounds. So here's a quote, which is in Gardener's Companion, originally from his book, The Garden Lover, 1928. There are two parts to the common day, the performance of the day and the background of the day. Many of us are so submerged in the work we do and in the pride of life that the real day slips by, unnoted and unknown. But there are some who part the hours now and then and let the background show through. There are others who keep the sentiments alive as an undertone and who hang all the hours of work on a golden cord, connecting everything and losing none. Theirs is the full life. Their backgrounds are never forgotten, and the backgrounds are the realities. In his work as a pioneer of the field of landscape gardening, which today is known more as landscape architecture, Bailey was familiar with the term background in terms of the design of a home or garden, as in the illustrations of a house and a home that we saw in the previous slide. As the years passed, however, that word background began to take on a new meaning in his writings. In the early 1900s, as he grew to national prominence as a leader in both the nature study movement and country life movement, he became invested in the philosophical project of helping people redirect their attention away from what seemed to him like some of the more superficial distractions of modern consumerism and back toward the natural world and our place in it. He was far from anti-modern, as we heard earlier, but he believed that humans and everything involved in civilization were still a part of nature, and that losing track of that fact would cause people to lose their way in life. Notice in this illustration that you see here how the trees and shrubs form a background for the conversation happening with the children. The landscape gardening here helps to frame the conversation and thought process of the gathering. You imagine that the conversation can't help but be influenced by the songs of birds in the trees, by the insects whirring by, and by the breeze rustling through the high tree branches. The vegetation around the periphery of the illustration form a sort of background space that Bailey believed to be important to people's mental and spiritual health. By reorienting our attention back towards such background spaces and engaging with the plants and animals we find there, Bailey believed we could hold on to an important part of ourselves that commercial modernity sometimes threatened. You might imagine him encouraging the children in this picture after their huddle to spread out along the line of trees and shrubs to see what they find there. As he writes in the block quotation, the day itself has a sort of background, and it is important to part the hours now and then and let the background show through. He elaborated these ideas further in a series that he titled The Background Books. Which he published from 1915 to 1928. Far from a mere backdrop or a setting to a stage or something, Bailey believed what he called the everlasting backgrounds to be more real than most of the artificial elements that humans build around their lives, and more vital to human flourishing. As he wrote in the first of the background books, which was The Holy Earth, which you see here, the backgrounds are important. The life of every one of us is relative. We miss our destiny when we miss or forget our backgrounds. We lose ourselves. Men go off in vague heresies when they forget the conditions against which they live. Judgments become too refined, and men tend to become merely disputatious and subtle. The backgrounds are the great unoccupied spaces. They are the large environments in which we live, but which we do not make, to which we adjust our civilization, and by which we measure ourselves. And on the screen, you can see again the cover of the centennial edition of The Holy Earth, which features a photograph taken by Bailey and now a part of the collection of the Liberty Hyde Bailey Museum and Gardens in South Haven, which depicts Bailey's daughter, Sarah, leaning against a tree at the old farm in Michigan, her attention drawn along the line of trees to the background of the picture and the whispers of wind through the distant leaves. Finally, we come to marvels at our feet. Here's this quotation. Everyone, the quotation is incorrect, in fact, on this slide, so you'll just have to listen to what I tell you. Everyone should be put in contact with the mystery of life that stands stark before us, but which we do not apprehend. It is in every leaf, every growing thing, every pulse of life, every foot of earth on the planet. The rapture of life grows as our knowledge grows. It is unnecessary to go to faraway places to see marvels. The mystery is always at our door. During Bailey's most productive years, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he became heavily involved in a number of social movements aimed at bettering the living conditions in rural areas and empowering cooperative farm communities. Sometimes he's been criticized for moving away from such work after retiring and focusing more on botanical collecting and taxonomy. One scholar described this as Bailey's retreat to the brambles. referring to Bailey's fascination with rubus, the genus including raspberries and blackberries. In the photo at the left, we see him in 1949, the year he turned 91, surrounded by specimens he had collected from around the world. He was sitting for a Life magazine photo shoot for an article profiling the nonagenarian globetrotter who had missed his 90th birthday party while on a palm collecting trip in the Caribbean. But labeling his long, productive retirement as a retreat to the brambles would seem to miss the relationship Bailey always felt between his horticultural work and his social and philosophical work. After Bailey retired from his position as Dean of the College of Agriculture at Cornell University in 1913, he did begin to devote more time to botanical collecting and building up his horticultural herbarium, which is a collection of dried plant specimens used for taxonomic identification. Bailey published many articles on the cultivated plants he studied, but not just academic papers. He continued publishing literary garden writing in many popular magazines and journals. In fact, 28 out of the 50 selections included in our anthology were written or published in Bailey's retirement years. It was during these retirement years that he published his series of 7 background books that I just mentioned, outlining the philosophy behind his understanding of the nature study and country life movements. He edited his monumental Standard Cyclopedia of Horticulture, which was an updated reworking of his earlier Cyclopedia of American Horticulture, and which would continue to serve as a standard reference for gardeners and horticulturists throughout the 20th century. He also produced a number of other practical reference works, like the Pruning Manual, the Cultivated Evergreens, Hortus, which was the first dictionary of horticulture, and Gardener's Handbook. And he edited dozens of reference works from Macmillan's various series on farming and gardening, all of which would provide authoritative information for people engaged in practical life in the country. With his daughter Ethel, he compiled 4 volumes of a series he called Rus, R-U-S, a biographical register of rural leadership in the US and Canada, published between the years 1918 and 1930. He wrote educational books like the School Book of Farming in 1920 and How Plants Get Their Names in 1933. And he wrote his series of 4 garden books, as he called them, between 1937 and 1953, the year before he died, which brought together art and science with prominent illustrations by artists like Florence McKeel and Elizabeth Birkmeyer. He had stepped away from administrative duties, which his daughter later reported had driven him close to a nervous breakdown at Cornell at the age of 55. But for 40 more years, he devoted himself to work meant to help anyone who wanted to tend a bit of the earth and become better acquainted with the plants that they grew. Bailey enjoyed traveling around the world in his retirement, seeking to make sense out of the taxonomic puzzles presented by plant families related to human cultivation, like the palms. You can see a picture of him surrounded by palms on the right here. Rubus, which I mentioned earlier, the gourds, and many others. But he always came home to the land, to his gardens and greenhouses. As his late life writings attest, he continued to find satisfaction in gardening and wonder in nature into his last years. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s spurred a resurgence of activism around issues of land conservation, which continued through the 1940s. Part of this was due to the advocacy of a group called the Friends of the Land, an alliance of farmers, ecologists, writers, and artists who disseminated information on land stewardship and published a quarterly journal titled The Land. When the group was first forming, they came to old Dean Bailey, then well into his 80s, for advice. And again, this is the wrong quote. So Bailey was encouraging, noting that it reminded him of an old proposal he had written for a Society of the Holy Earth. The editor of The Land, Russell Lord, sent a copy of the first issue of the quarterly to Bailey, whose grateful letter in response was published in the second issue of the magazine. 5 years later, at the age of 87, Bailey contributed an essay to The Land titled Marvels at Our Feet, which along with the brief manifesto for Society of the Holy Earth forms the epilogue to the Liberty Hyde Bailey Gardener's Companion. As Bailey describes in this quotation from the essay, which we looked at just moments ago, which we heard just moments ago because it didn't end up in the slide, Bailey continued to find life itself to be a mystery, and one that invited endless discovery in every encounter with, quote, every leaf, every growing thing, every pulse of life, every foot of earth on the planet. And because I didn't get that on the slide, I'm just going to read that quotation one more time. Everyone should be put in contact with the mystery of life that stands stark before us, but which we do not apprehend. It is in every leaf, every growing thing, every pulse of life, every foot of earth on the planet. The rapture of life grows as our knowledge grows. It is unnecessary to go to faraway places to see marvels. The mystery is always at our door. Bailey had continued to marvel at the wonders that presented themselves to him every year in his garden, across the decades since that first garden of pinks left to him by his mother, and continued to insist that everyone deserved to be put in contact with that garden sentiment. And at the end of that 1945 essay, he wrote this: "We deceive ourselves if we turn from the essentials and try to satisfy ourselves with the small and trivial gratifications of this age. Let us look more closely about us and see how good are the common things, how marvelous are all things made at the beginning. The meaning of life is in its beauty, and 10,000 years from now, children will call across the centuries that the world is young, that the sunshine is good, that love and faith and mystery and the buoyancy of life are the only realities." So I think that is a good note to end on. I hope this presentation has given you a little more insight into the life and ideas of Liberty Hyde Bailey, child of the Michigan countryside and patron saint of American gardening. Feel free to reach out at the email address here with any questions, and please follow the Liberty Hyde Bailey Library on social media at LH Bailey Library. Thanks again for the opportunity to share Bailey's story with you today. Keep gardening and keep marveling.